Okay, welcome back. In this part, I want to just show you how I made the decorative trim for our cupboard here. The last time you saw this, it was a little plainer. So I've gone along and created some of this kind of decorative molding. Now, as you can see, it's geometry. It's fairly quadded. In fact, it's very quadded. So, you can do this with displacement at render time. Sometimes you actually want the geometry there for texturing purposes and whatnot. And this doesn't actually take that long to create. Now, I also wanted to show you a couple of different Maya plugins. So if we take a look here, I'm going to be using iDisplace, which is a fantastic displacement deformer. I'm also going to be using Soup, which you generally would use for dynamics, but it does have a fantastic smoothing algorithm. So in this part, we're just going to get to grips with how I created these elements, but also it'll give me the opportunity to show you these two quite fabulous plugins. So let's see this first. We'll just create this, and I started off with a simple black and white image. Okay, so all I've done is brought it into Photoshop and just blurred it and smoothed it out a little bit. Okay, you can draw any image you want. You can find many of these kind of black and white vector style images on the internet, and this technique will work with pretty much all of them. Okay, so let's start out with a polygonal plane. So I'm just going to create one of those, and I'll get it to sort of the size that I want it. It's not really too important at the moment. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to overlay the black and white image on this and then use the iDisplace deformer to actually create the geometry. Now, Maya can do this as well, but I'll show you why we don't use it. Let's assign a new material. Let's assign a Lambert, and we want its shading group, so just click for downwards and give it a displacement material. And in this case, I'm going to use that black and white file we saw in Photoshop earlier. Okay, so Vine inlay, okay, and you won't actually see it on here. It's a displacement material, not a surface shader. So let's just go to Maya and let's give this a bit more geometry. So Maya has something to displace, and let's say we make this kind of 200 by 200. There we go. So we're dealing with quite a lot of geometry. It can be cleaned up later, and it's quite a small piece, so should be fine. And let's just go to edit. Actually, that would be modify, convert, and you'll see displacement to polygons. Now this will attempt to convert that displacement material to polygons, hence the name, I guess. And I'm going to pause the video because Maya does take its time with this. Okay, so Maya finished that. It took about a minute, so not too bad really. And now I'm just going to rotate this around. I'm going to center its pivot, just so we can take a look at that displacement as it comes through. So let's just flip this. And if we click off, you can see Maya did a fairly reasonable job. We can definitely see the pattern there. The normals are all screwed up. So if I just reverse those, we should be able to see this a little better. There we go. Actually, no. So let's find out why this is just not good. I mean, Maya generally doesn't do too good a job on this, so I tend not to use it. But anyway, you can see the pattern is there. It's not too bad. But if I click on it, you'll see this geometry. It's absolutely horrendous. I mean, you just wouldn't want this. It's very difficult to work with. It couldn't really be smoothed. I mean, that's your lot, basically. So, it doesn't do a bad job, but for all intents and purposes, it's pretty unusable. So if we click this off, and instead we use the iDisplace deformer. So I'm going to bring up the hotbox, and under Create Deformers, you'll see iDeform. Now, after you've downloaded and installed this, if you're not seeing that under your Create Deformers, you'll need to actually load the plugins in. So if you just go to Preferences, Plugin Manager, you'll see I've got both Soup and iDeform loaded. You just want to click Browse and tell it where you've installed them. So me, I've put them in Program Files, Autodesk Maya plugins. So you just click this and hit Open, and that will load in the plugin. So if you're not seeing those plugins, you might need to go and load them in. Alright, so Create Deformers, iDeform, iDisplace, right, and you'll see nothing's happened. That's because iDisplace doesn't use the displacement material. You have to go in, find its tab under the geometry you applied it to, and give it a texture. So in our case, once again, we're just going to use that texture file that we saw in Photoshop, so Vine Inlay. Okay, and you'll see that the same thing has happened. Our displacement has gone down. However, with iDisplace, we can come in and just reverse that. So I'll put the scale to say -0.3, and there we go. You'll also notice that iDisplace was a lot faster than Maya. Maya took about a minute, to make any changes, and iDisplace is pretty interactive. Okay, so just find a height that you're happy with. I think about 0.35 will do for me. Might even be a bit high. Again, it comes down to what you're trying to achieve. And what we've got here is much better geometry. Okay, so instead of that completely unworkable, nasty mess that Maya gives you, I now have pretty decent geometry, and it's looking all right. It's not very smooth, but we'll sort that out in a second. Now, if you want a higher resolution, you can always come in under the original polyplane. We can go from 200 to say 400, and you'll get a warning telling you that's a lot of geometry, but that'll be okay. And there you go. I got a much higher res now. Alright, so we need to look at reducing the amount of polygons we've got here. So if I just focus in on this and bring it up, hit 6 for shaded view, I can actually just start to chop a few polygons out. So let's go into face mode. And the point here is not to get stunningly perfect geometry. You want something you can work with, but this is supposed to be a fast process. And as I've said before, you could use even displacement at render time, but this for me is looking pretty good. So I've got a few kind of niggles here, but unless you're going to get sort of here, you're never ever going to see it. And that's what I wanted to use Soup for. Now, if I wanted to smooth this even more, you're going to start to run into that problem of you're just going to have too much geometry. I mean, this is fairly high poly. It's nothing we can't work with, though. But going any higher than this, it's probably not a good idea. And to start to see a real difference in the smoothing, probably would have to subdivide this 2 or 3 times, and by which point, just too much. So I introduce you to Soup. Now, Soup is normally used in Dynamics. It's got a whole bunch of nodes. Each one of these is a Soup node that'll do something. I highly recommend that you look up the Soup project and play with the plugin. It's a great plugin. But at the moment, we're just going to use the Smooth. So that'll load in a Soup Smoothment node. And you'll see here, I now have the iDisplace node still on here. So before we go ahead and do anything else, we should probably delete the history on this. Let's just go edit, delete by type, history. Because when you're doing a sort of a CPU intensive operation, as the Smooth will be, you don't want it calculating a bunch of history as well. So just remove that history and once again apply the Smooth node, which you'll see here. Go under Attribute Editor, you can see it a bit better, and you'll also find it here. Okay, so it doesn't seem to have done anything. That's because it has no iterations. So let's put the iterations up to 1. You see it's smoothed down? I'll just flick that back so you can see it again. Okay, it's kind of smoothed that down without adding a whole bunch more geometry. So Soup is absolutely great for that. If you want to smooth, but you don't actually want to subdivide, which is what Maya does, it'll just add more geo to smooth the shape out. Then Soup has a wonderful smoothing node, can be used in lots of different circumstances. Okay, so now we have our decorative trim. If I was to do, say, and let's just delete the history on that because we're dragging around this smooth node. And if you smooth, and delete the history, then obviously you won't be able to come in and add more iterations. You will be able to add a new smooth node. So just be aware, get it as smooth as you want it, and then delete the history. So edit, delete by type, history. Okay, and let's say I wanted to put sort of a decorative inlay on the top here. So I can now just literally move this up and countersink it into the top. Okay, so let me just focus on that so I can see what I'm doing. And of course it'd be easier if I use the 4 views, but it shouldn't take too much effort. There we go. Okay, so now I can just sort of grab this, and if I wanted, say, a decorative inlay in these corners here, and just down a tad, and let's just use the 4 view for that. There we go. In fact, that's pretty good. Alright, so there you go. There is one decorative inlay that doesn't require displacement at render time. So I'll just assign a new material to this so we can just sort of change the color of it. Have a look. Okay, there you go. One pretty fancy decorative inlay done in just a couple of minutes. So, you know, it's dependent on you. You can do that with displacement. There are reasons why I like not to. I can now kind of independently texture this. You know, I can take it into something like Mari or ZBrush and kind of paint in all sorts of little details, maybe a gold leaf pattern, which would be more difficult with displacement at render time. I would also take this into ZBrush, probably retopologize it. It will allow me to get rid of this big base plate here that I don't actually need. But you know, for a really fast, simple solution to making this sort of molding, there you go. And as you can see, I've used it down here on more complicated shapes. And if I look at this one, you'll see this one is a lot lighter in geometry. So I've just used less subdivisions on the plane. I've also gone in and, you know, made a better job of cleaning up those back faces. But it's not strictly necessary. You know, if you're just looking for a quick, easy way to do complicated molding, to add sort of an extra dimension to your furniture, there it is. Alright, so I will see you in the next part. I hope I've covered something that was of interest to you, and please do, part of this was that I could show you the iDisplace plugin and also Soup. Please do check out those two plugins if you're not familiar with them. They are both excellent. Alright, so thank you very much for watching once again, and I'll see you in the next part.